In 1987, 7 children walked into Miller's Woods and never came back. No cries, no struggle, just the quiet rustling of berry leaves in the breeze, and then nothing. 10 years later, when we returned with dogs and shovels, it wasn't just bones we found under the soil. It was a pattern. And what it meant still keeps me awake, especially in late September, when the woods go silent again. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from down in the comments, and tap that like and subscribe if stories like this ever brushed past your hometown or your own life. Every click helps pull another forgotten name back into the light. My name is Martha Ann Heller. I was 47 years old that fall. I've lived in Lancaster County my whole life, just like my mother and grandmother before me. We didn't have much in the way of modern things, no TV, no electricity in the house, but we had order, rhythm, peace. We lived by the sun, the seasons, and our trust in one another. My husband Elias and I owned a dairy farm tucked against the eastern edge of Miller's Woods, just past Beeler's Creek. Our children, Mary Ellen and Jacob, grew up knowing every path and berry thicket in those trees. In our way of life, children walk together. They help each other, they don't wander, and they always come back before the bell rings for lunch. That week in September, the blackberries were ripe, almost falling off the stem. The girls were gathering for the church social. They needed baskets full for the pies and jams we'd sell on Saturday. Mary asked me that morning if she could take the younger ones out to pick just for an hour or two. I was kneading bread dough, and I remember I looked up and smiled. "Stay together," I said, brushing flour from her cheek. "Be back before lunch." Those were the last words I ever spoke to her. They walked off just after 8:00 a.m., 7 of them total, Mary and Jacob, Sarah Lynn Miller, the Beeler twins Ruth and Rebecca, little David Yoder with his grass-stained shoes, and Samuel Fisher, quiet as ever, whistling a tune only birds could follow, all of them dressed in their Sunday best. That was Mary's idea. She said the berries deserved respect. Around 11:30, Mrs. Byler stepped out to check on them. She was bringing fresh jars for jam and thought she'd help gather the last stretch of bushes. She didn't come back with berries. She came back with a bonnet. Mary's blue bonnet. I still remember how it felt in my hands, damp from morning dew caught on a low branch like someone had run straight through. And the baskets were there too, tipped over in the leaves. But no footprints, no broken stems, no sign of where the children had gone. That's what I remember most. Not the panic, not the shouting later, just the silence. Like the woods were holding their breath, and something was already gone. When Ruth and Rebecca didn't come through the fence gate for lunch, their mother sent me a look I still remember. Not panic, not yet more like confusion with a shadow behind it. That gate had always squeaked. We would have heard it. The twins never missed lunch, not once. I stepped out onto the porch and scanned the tree line. Nothing but stillness. By then the sun was high and the berry patch should have been buzzing with voices. I told Elias to go check. He didn't say a word, just wiped his hands on his apron and walked toward the woods. 5 minutes later, I followed with 2 others. When we reached the clearing, we found the baskets first. They were laid out in the grass like someone had dropped them mid-step. Not tipped or thrown, just scattered gently, some still upright, some on their side empty. Mary's bonnet was looped around a branch, the string frayed like it had been yanked off quickly. There were no footprints in the loam, no broken stems, no signs of running. That's what stayed with me. No struggle. Just stillness. The forest was quiet in a way that felt wrong. No bird song, no insects, not even wind through the trees. It was the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring like you're waiting for something loud to break it. We called their names. I remember shouting Jacob until my voice cracked. Elias cupped his hands and called for Mary. Nothing answered us, not even an echo. Within the hour, the whole settlement had gathered. Every father, every mother, every able body. The children were kept inside. We spread out into groups of 3 and began walking line by line through the woods. Each person took a strip 10 feet wide and combed every inch of ground, slow and methodical. We looked in every hollow log, every ditch behind every tree. Some of the younger men climbed into the denser groves with lanterns. I stayed in the clearing, circling it over and over, trying to make sense of the patterns in the moss, the bends in the grass. Something had happened there. We just couldn't see what. By evening, lanterns were lit and the search continued. No one ate. The women brought water in jars and hot broth in covered pots, but it mostly went untouched. I remember standing shoulder to shoulder with Sarah Lynn's father Henry as the sky turned purple behind the pines. He was shaking, but he never stopped calling her name. Elias came back from the east trail empty-handed, mud on his boots, his face pale as wax. When I asked if he saw anything, he just said, "The birds aren't coming back." That night we searched through darkness, our voices threading between the trees like the fog. Some folks swore they saw movement shapes darting between trunks, shadows that didn't belong to anyone. Others said they heard whispers. I didn't see or hear a thing. Just the quiet, too wide and too deep, like the woods had swallowed sound itself. By dawn our voices were hoarse. Some men had bloodied hands from pushing aside brambles. A few of the older women sat together in the schoolhouse, rocking in silence. We had covered the woods twice and found no sign of 7 children. That morning, we held a meeting in the barn behind the Baylor's property. It was cold inside, smelled of hay and sweat and oil from the lanterns. Elder Abraham Byler stood at the front and said we needed to decide what came next. Some of us expected him to suggest contacting the sheriff. Instead, he cleared his throat and said firmly, "We will handle this within our own walls." A few murmured agreement, but not many. I saw Henry Miller stand. "My daughter is out there," he said, voice cracking. "And you think the Lord doesn't work through help when it's offered?" Abraham shook his head. "The moment we open our gates, the moment we let them in, it won't stop at the search. They'll ask questions we're not prepared to answer. They'll take over. And once that happens, we don't get our say back." There was silence. Then Henry turned to me. "Martha," he said, "what if it was just Mary who was missing? Would you wait another day?" I didn't answer, not because I didn't know, but because I did. The argument lasted most of the morning. Some folks backed the elder, others, like Henry and Elias, pressed for outside help. But Abraham reminded them of what had happened months earlier. A merchant passing through had vanished near these woods. His wagon was found half-buried, horses still tied to the fence looking starved. The community had found remnants in the trees, torn fabric, a satchel, a boot. But also strange things. Etchings in bark, small shapes made of twigs and twine. Items that didn't belong to the man or to anyone we knew. And Abraham had told us all then, "Bury it. Don't speak of it. The law doesn't understand us, and it wouldn't understand this." So we followed. Now, standing in that barn, he reminded us what might come if we brought them in. "They'll dig," he said, "and they'll find more than just the merchant." He was right, and we all knew it. But still, 7 children. 7. Henry finally said he'd go on foot to the next town and send for help himself if no one else would. In the end, a compromise was made. Give it one more day, one final full search, and if nothing was found by sundown, we would call the sheriff. It was a heavy silence that followed. I watched Abraham close his eyes and nod, but he looked older than I had ever seen him. That second day we searched again, harder. We expanded the grid past the old creek bed up into the slope where the trees grow tight and sharp. We looked under brush piles, inside rotted-out stumps, in every place a child might crawl to hide. But there were no signs of struggle, no scraps of fabric, no broken branches, just the same stillness. The only thing we found, and it was found by one of the teenage boys helping, was a small circle of stones perfectly shaped tucked between the roots of an elm. He didn't know what it meant, and neither did we. Abraham saw it, said nothing, and kicked it apart. That night Henry sat on our porch and told Elias tomorrow we call. I don't care what he says. Elias nodded. By then even those loyal to Abraham had run out of answers. The woods had given us nothing. Our children were still missing. We made the call the next morning on the only phone line in town borrowed from a family who used it for deliveries. Sheriff James Morrison arrived 5 hours later, his deputy behind him, both of them in worn boots and with tired eyes. I'll never forget the way Morrison looked at the tree line when he got out of his car. It was like he could feel it too, the weight of something hiding just out of reach. The first question he asked was, "Why didn't you call sooner?" And none of us had a good answer. I think that was the moment the real shame started to settle in. But by then, it was already the third day. The ground had been walked 100 times. The scent trails had gone cold, and whatever had happened in those woods, it was already 3 days ahead of us. That afternoon, Deputy Sarah Chen interviewed Mrs. Beeler. She asked about the berry patch, what she saw. Rebecca and Ruth's mother wrung her hands in her apron and whispered something I've never forgotten. The woods, she said they weren't right that day. It wasn't just quiet, it felt emptied out. Chen looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "The birds," she said. "They left. I didn't hear a single one. Even the bugs were gone. The deputy didn't write that part down. But I saw her face. She heard it. We all did." And as the sun began to dip behind the treetops, the sheriff ordered search dogs brought in, but they wouldn't arrive until morning. Another night would pass with no answers. 7 children gone. Not a footprint, not a sound. Just silence. And something beginning to stir beneath it. The search dogs arrived just after sunrise. 3 German shepherds, lean and alert, stepping out of the back of 2 patrol trucks, their paws hitting the gravel like they already knew this place didn't want them. The handlers were quiet professionals, the kind who didn't need to say much. Sheriff Morrison stood off to the side, arms crossed, watching every move. I remember feeling hopeful for the first time in days, not because I thought they'd find the children, but because I thought maybe something would finally break. Maybe this silence we'd been drowning in would finally crack open. One of the deputies handed the handlers items wrapped in clear plastic clothing from each of the 7 kids. I could tell which ones belonged to mine. Mary's apron had a patch she'd sewn herself. Jacob's cap was still dusty from the barn. The handlers gave the dogs a moment, letting them sniff their noses, working fast and steady. Then they moved toward the woods. They followed the same route the children had taken from the back fence. The dogs picked up the scent right away. Their bodies tensed, ears forward, tails stiff with purpose. It was like watching something mechanical, precise, trained, efficient. They reached the edge of the berry patch and kept going. For about 50 yards, everything seemed to be working. Then it happened. All 3 stopped at the same place. No signal, no command, just stopped cold. One of them whimpered. Another backed up and sat down. The third turned in a tight circle and tried to pull away from the woods entirely. The handlers tried to coax them forward, but the dogs wouldn't go. They weren't tired and they weren't distracted. They were scared. One of the handlers, a man named Mike Stevens, crouched beside his dog and tried to calm him. "He's never done this before," I heard him say more to himself than anyone else. "He's tracked through swamps, fire scenes, flood zones. But this..." He didn't finish. Sheriff Morrison asked if it could be a wild animal. Bear, maybe. Something that would trigger the dog's instincts. But Stevens shook his head. "These dogs are trained not to flinch at wildlife. They've worked scenes with dead bodies, active shooters, you name it. This is different. They're not sensing something out there. They're sensing something in here." He tapped the side of his head. I didn't understand it then. Not really. I just knew that whatever those dogs felt was strong enough to override everything they'd been taught. They tried 3 more times from 3 different entry points along the woods. Same result every time. The dogs would pick up the scent, then freeze, whimper, and pull back. One even lay down and refused to move at all. Dr. Angela Foster, a behavioral specialist, was called in that afternoon. She examined the dogs, ran tests on their stress levels, monitored heart rates. Afterward, she told the sheriff, "Whatever they're picking up on, it's triggering their deepest fear response. You could force them, but it might break them permanently." I remember standing beside Ruth Byler's mother as she listened to that. She didn't say a word, just kept squeezing a handkerchief until the corners frayed. We'd been waiting 3 days for a trail, and now the only creatures who could have followed it were telling us no. Not here. Not this place. That afternoon, the investigation shifted. The command post was moved to the edge of the community center. Folding tables were brought in, maps pinned down with coffee mugs, search grids drawn and redrawn. Deputies rotated through shifts. Volunteers came from nearby towns. But inside the settlement, the tension was growing. Morrison's questions were getting sharper. The elders were growing quieter. He asked us why we waited so long, why 3 days had passed before the first call. No one had a clean answer, not even Abraham. Mrs. Byler was interviewed again, this time more formally. Deputy Chen asked about what she saw that morning, the baskets, the bonnet, anything that stood out. She hesitated. You could see it in the way she pressed her hands into her lap. Chen leaned in gently. Was there anything unusual, she asked? Even something small. Mrs. Byler swallowed hard and said, "The birds. What about them?" They stopped. She looked up. The woods were too quiet. No wings, no buzz. It was like everything was holding its breath. Chen paused, then nodded slowly. "Thank you." She didn't write it down, but it changed something in the air. The next few days blurred. Search crews fanned out across the property. Forest rangers joined in. They used thermal imaging radar metal detectors. Every ravine, every rock outcrop, every abandoned shed within a 5-mile radius was searched. Still nothing. But what people did report was strange. A few volunteers said they felt watched. Others claimed to hear voices whispering just beyond the tree line. A teenage boy came running back one afternoon, pale as snow, swearing. He saw a figure standing deep in the woods. Someone too tall, too still. But when a group went to check, there was no one there. Just a small pile of stones stacked in a spiral. They didn't touch it. They just marked the spot and moved on. And then the news trucks started to show. First 1 van, then 3, then 10. We tried to keep them out, but there's only so much you can do when your tragedy becomes a headline. 7 Amish children. Vanish without a trace. It ran on every station that week. Reporters lined the fences. Drones flew overhead. Microphones were shoved through cracks in the barn walls. I saw Rebecca and Ruth's father lose his temper with one of them snapping a camera lens clean off its tripod, but it didn't stop. They kept coming. Talking heads on TV speculated about trafficking, forest cults, supernatural nonsense. Some blamed us, said we were too isolated, too proud, too secretive, that if we'd called sooner the kids might have been found. The judgment stung, but not as much as the helplessness. Every day we had to walk past empty rooms, plates still set for breakfast, coats still hanging by the door. Sheriff Morrison called another meeting with the elders. This time he wasn't as patient. "You're not telling me everything he said. There's something in those woods that's not right, and you know it." Abraham didn't speak at first, just stared down at the table. Finally he said, "There are things we buried for a reason." Morrison leaned forward. Things like what Abraham's hand trembled as he reached for a folded paper in his coat. It was a map, hand-drawn, old, smudged at the corners. He pointed to a spot deep in the woods. 3 months ago, a traveler went missing here, he said. We found his wagon, his boots, his knife, and something else. What else, Morrison asked. Abraham didn't answer. But I knew. We all did. We'd seen the carvings, the bones that didn't belong to any animal. The shapes hung from branches like they were meant to be seen and feared. We buried them. We prayed over them, and then we looked the other way. But now, with 7 children missing, the past was pressing up through the soil again. Morrison stood slowly and said, "If you want me to find them, I need to see everything. No more silence. No more secrets." And for the first time, Abraham nodded. Quiet. Reluctant. But he nodded. He told us to meet at sundown behind the old meeting house. Bring lanterns. Bring gloves. What he was going to show us, he said, was not meant for daylight. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did. We didn't know it then, but the search for our children wasn't heading toward answers. It was heading into something far older and far worse. We met just after dusk behind the meeting house. No announcements, no formal gathering, just a quiet understanding that if you needed to know what was buried out there, you'd be there. I remember the crunch of gravel under boots, the shuffling of men who'd barely slept in days. Most of us carried lanterns. Abraham had a satchel in one hand and the map in the other, the one he'd shown to Morrison. There was a chill in the air that hadn't been there earlier, like the temperature dropped only inside the tree line. We followed in single file, winding behind the grain sheds, past the dry creek bed, and into a thicket most of us hadn't walked through in years. The brush here grew thick and cross-hatched, heavy with late summer moisture. I'd forgotten how dark it could get under that canopy, even with lamps held high. We walked without speaking. No one needed to be told that silence was part of what we were carrying in. Abraham stopped beside a ring of stones I hadn't seen before. He set the satchel down and began pulling out oilcloth bundles one at a time, laying them out gently on a wide, flat rock. A small pile of bones, carved, arranged. Some had markings burned into the surface. Others were etched with patterns that didn't look like letters or numbers, just shapes that made your stomach tighten when you tried too hard to make sense of them. Morrison took one look and asked, "Where did these come from?" Abraham didn't look up. Near the south fence, after the merchant went missing. We didn't tell anyone. Morrison kept his voice low. "Why?" "Because we thought it was over," Abraham said. "We thought if we put it back in the ground, it wouldn't spread." Morrison radioed for his partner and 2 deputies. They marked the location, took photographs, logged every item. No one wanted to touch the bones more than once. That was the start of the deeper search. From that night on, the investigation moved in a direction most of us weren't prepared for. The sheriff stopped calling it a disappearance. His notes started listing it as unconfirmed abduction, then possible ritual homicide. The words sat hard on the tongue even when no one said them aloud. I remember one morning about 5 days in, Elias came home after helping the deputies clear out an old hunting shed. He walked in, took off his boots, and sat on the floor with his back to the pantry. Just sat there. I asked what they'd found. He shook his head. Nothing, he said. But it smelled like fear. I didn't ask what that meant. I just brought him a cup of water and sat beside him until the sun moved across the kitchen floor. By the end of that week, the national media had started circling again. More vans, more cameras, and with them, more people, volunteers, searchers, folks with psychic visions, people who claimed to know about symbols and signs and ancient things. It became harder to keep our children's names from being twisted into something else. We stopped watching the news. Morrison did his best to keep order, but it was clear he was under pressure. State authorities got involved. Federal agents were called. The FBI sent a woman named Patricia Wells, tall, formal, the kind of person who listened for a long time before saying a single word. She spent hours in the woods walking the same paths, mapping intersections between what we had found and what had gone unspoken for years. She interviewed Abraham alone for almost 3 hours. Afterward, she told Morrison, "This isn't random. If it's what I think it is, they were preparing for this for a long time." The phrase she used was ritual operation site. I didn't even know what that meant. But I remember how Morrison changed after that. He stopped sleeping. He barely ate. His deputy, Sarah Chen, started taking calls alone, reporting back in short, clipped sentences. A profiler named Marcus Reed joined the team. He wore thick glasses and carried spiral notebooks instead of a badge. He studied the carvings, the bones, the way the stones had been arranged. "It's not about the children," he said one night. "It's about what the children represent." I didn't want to hear any more. I went outside and stood under the kitchen eaves while the rain came in sideways. It was the first night I let myself cry. The community had started to unravel. Sunday services became quiet. Some families moved in with relatives across county lines. Others kept their doors locked, their windows boarded from the inside. No one let their children out of sight. And even with all that, with the FBI combing through old mail routes and property deeds and burial records, the woods stayed silent. No bodies, no voices, no sign of the 7. What we had was absence and fear. On the 9th day, Morrison called a town meeting. He stood in front of us, not as a sheriff, but as someone who knew what it meant to lose something too large to name. He explained what they believed had happened, that the carvings matched those found in known cult investigations across several states. That the number 7 appeared intentionally. That the equinox was 4 days away, and if these people were operating on a ritual calendar, then timing mattered. He didn't say sacrifice, but we heard it in the quiet after. Patricia Wells confirmed it later that night in private. She said, "If they're still alive, that date is what we're running against." From that moment, the search changed again. Helicopters were brought in. Ground-penetrating radar was used over every square mile surrounding the settlement. Redacted records were pulled from old mental hospitals and off-the-books properties flagged in similar cases. Volunteers covered barn roofs in red paint, hoping to jog someone's memory of a hiker's report or a driver's glimpse. Officers were flown in from out of state. Deputies rotated out in shifts no longer than 6 hours. It felt like we were racing something invisible. Not just time, something older, deeper. A current running beneath everything just out of reach. On the 11th day, someone spotted smoke. Thin gray, not from a chimney. The area was searched within minutes. Nothing was found, no fire, no ashes, just a spot in the woods where the leaves had turned black without burning. The ground smelled of copper and mildew. That night the dogs were brought out again. The new handler tried 3 different entry points. Each time the dogs walked about 20 yards, stopped and whimpered. One of them refused food for 2 days after. Dr. Foster returned to examine them. "They're not reacting to a body," she said. "They're reacting to memory." The morning after that, a postcard arrived. No return address. No message. Just an old photograph clipped from a magazine, 7 children playing in a field, none of them ours. But on the back, written in red marker, were the words, "Almost there." The FBI traced the paper to a print shop in Ohio, but the lead went cold. We still don't know who sent it. That night I sat by the fire with Mary's dress in my lap. I kept telling myself it still smelled like soap and sunlight. But it didn't. It smelled like cedar and dust and waiting. Everything in that house had started to feel like waiting. And somewhere in the woods I knew something or someone was waiting too. What I didn't know yet was that it had been waiting much longer than any of us imagined. And we were the ones who'd arrived late. It was the 12th day when we found it. A piece of cloth, small torn, wedged into the bark of a tree about 30 feet from the southern fence line. It could have been anything, a remnant from years back left by a hunter or blown by wind. But when Morrison held it up, I recognized the color right away. Sky blue with a hand-stitched seam along the edge. Mary's dress. It had frayed from the shoulder the week before, and I'd patched it with thread we dyed from elderberries. The color was too exact to be a coincidence. The tear matched where the stitching had started to come loose. Morrison didn't say much. He placed it gently in an evidence bag and handed it off to Chen, who cataloged it and marked the tree. I just stood there staring at that bit of bark like it might offer something else an answer, a direction, something we could follow. But it didn't. It just sat there in the quiet, waiting. The ground beneath the tree was soft, turned over in places that didn't quite match the rest of the forest floor. We thought maybe an animal had dug there. A few men used small spades to test the soil. About 8 inches down, they found a child's shoe. Black scuffed the sole, worn thin. The size matched what Sarah Lynn had been wearing that morning. Her mother confirmed it without hesitation. Then came a suspender torn along the middle. Jacob's. His name had been inked on the inside clasp like we did with all the boys' clothes during harvest season just to keep track. That was when the mood shifted. This wasn't just a trail, it was a grave. The search team marked off the area and called for the forensic unit. Dr. Sarah Kim arrived later that day wearing gloves up to her elbows, kneeling quietly beside the hole with her sleeves rolled back and her eyes focused. She worked slow like someone trying not to wake something. With each scoop, more fabric came up. Bits of lace, buttons, a frilled apron, 7 children's worth of clothing, every piece placed in a circle like spokes of a wheel. Kim sat back after they finished cataloging. "It's not a dumping site," she said. "It's intentional, ritual." She didn't elaborate. She didn't have to. What made it worse was the absence. No bones, no hair, no bodies, just the clothes folded and arranged and left under soil that hadn't been disturbed in a decade. Morrison asked Kim if she thought they'd been moved. She shook her head. If they had, she said we'd see signs disturbed layering drag marks breakage. This wasn't moved. It was left like this on purpose. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking of Mary laying out her dress in the same pattern, folding it with her small hands, placing it down the way she placed her dolls beneath a blanket. But that wasn't what this was. This was someone else's idea of order. The next morning, they brought in a woman from the university, Professor Janet Mitchell. She specialized in ritual anthropology, which I didn't even know was a real thing. She stood over the burial site without speaking for a long time, then walked the perimeter, counting quietly to herself. 7 points, she said. 7 children, aligned like a compass rose. It's ceremonial. Morrison asked, "Does that mean they're alive?" Mitchell looked at him, then looked down at the soil. Not necessarily. But it means someone believed this arrangement mattered. In some traditions, removing the clothing is part of a symbolic transformation. Death, rebirth, transcendence. If they were alive when this was done, they wouldn't have stayed the same for long. That was the first time I heard the word indoctrination. It sounded clinical, cold, like something from a research paper. But what she meant was worse. If the children had survived, they'd been changed, reshaped by the people who took them, made to forget who they were. Or worse, made to remember differently. Later that day, one of the new tracking dogs, Duke, a German shepherd brought in from out of state, picked up a trail leading deeper into the woods. He was nervous, but willing ears twitching, breathing sharp nose to the ground. We followed him to a clearing we hadn't searched before, tucked behind a low ridge covered in pine. In the center was a circle of stones, each carved with the same strange symbols found on the old merchant's belongings. The clearing was silent. No birds, no bugs, just a hush that seemed to press against your chest. I watched Duke pause at the edge. He didn't go in. He just sat and stared at the center, unmoving. Morrison called for ground-penetrating radar. When the crew arrived, they swept the clearing and the surrounding area. It didn't take long. Beneath the soil, less than 2 feet down, was a structure, or rather a network. A series of small chambers, rectangular, patterned, interconnected. One technician turned to Morrison and said, "You've got tunnels, a whole system of them. Looks like rooms." I don't remember what was said after that. We stood in silence, watching the scanner lines reveal paths under the earth lines that twisted and turned like a map no one had drawn. They found the entrance the next morning hidden beneath a fallen log that had been hollowed from the inside. Morrison and a few agents descended first. I didn't go down. None of the parents did. But I remember the look on his face when he came back up gray still, like someone who'd walked too close to something ancient. He didn't speak right away. He just handed a flashlight to Agent Wells and told her, "There's a room with 7 cages." She nodded, said nothing, and went down herself. Later we learned what they'd found. Carvings on the walls, not just symbols, but full diagrams. Arcs, gates, circles within circles, and blood. Old dried smeared across the stone. The cages had rusted through in places, but they'd been sized for children. Padlocked, reinforced, lined with straw. One still held a small wooden toy, a carved figure with one eye burned black. Dr. Foster was brought back to assess the site. She walked the tunnel system for over an hour before emerging visibly shaken. "The dogs didn't freeze because of a person," she said. "They froze because the fear itself stayed here. It soaked into the walls." Later that evening, while cataloging the items found in one of the deepest chambers, a deputy came across a leather-bound journal. It was tucked behind a loose brick sealed in wax. The handwriting was tight, slanted, hard to read. The entries stretched back over 20 years. Notes, records, rituals, names of travelers, vague references to disappearances across counties. And near the final pages, the 7 innocents will complete the work. Their purity will open the way. Their fear prepares the soil. Morrison read it aloud in the barn where we'd gathered again, this time without the elders. Just the parents, just the ones still waiting. The last page read, "They crossed, willingly in the end. The gate opened. We go now to prepare the final path." I didn't understand what it meant. Not fully. But I knew that whatever had happened in those tunnels wasn't just a crime. It was a blueprint. A record of something done with intention, with belief, with patience. And it had been waiting there for 10 years beneath our feet. Buried, preserved, left behind like a warning. And we still hadn't found the children. Not their bodies, not their voices, just their clothes, their fear. And now the words of the people who had taken them, written in the past tense like it was already over. But for us, it wasn't. Not even close. After the journal was cataloged, Morrison stopped holding daily briefings. The meetings became smaller, quieter. Just a few names in a barn after dark, standing in the same circle where we used to plan harvest rotations. Now we were planning how to dig for things no one wanted to see. What stood out most in those last entries, besides the phrases that kept repeating the gate, the 7, the crossing, was the absolute certainty. Whoever wrote that journal didn't sound unstable. They sounded organized, focused, someone who believed exactly what they were doing and had time to do it well. Patricia Wells warned us to stop expecting mistakes. "You're not dealing with chaos," she told Morrison. This was constructed. Then she tapped the last page, and they knew when to leave. By that point, there was only 1 week left until the autumn equinox. For them, that meant something final. Morrison started calling in anyone who'd worked ritual cases before. Retired agents, specialists from other regions, even a former profiler who'd consulted on one of the old cult cases in Missouri. Each one said the same thing: we were already late. These groups didn't just disappear. They prepared fallback points, backup locations, ways to vanish when pressure closed in. and pressure was closing in. The case had made national headlines again. Satellite vans camped outside the tree line. A second wave of volunteers arrived, some helpful, most not. One woman came dressed in robes, holding a crystal on a string, whispering to the ground. Another claimed the children were being held in an energetic dimension and demanded access to the tunnels. Eventually, we had to post deputies along the back roads just to keep people from slipping in during the night. But there were too many places to watch, and the woods weren't finished with us yet. 2 nights before the equinox, someone broke into the meeting house. Nothing was stolen, but the oil lamps had been lit and left burning, each one placed at a point around the room, 7 in total. The journals and artifacts had already been removed and secured in Harrisburg, so there was nothing to take. Just the image. Just the message. Morrison said it was a warning. Reed said it was an invitation. Either way, it meant someone was still close. Not a memory, not a ghost, a person. Still watching us, still following the ritual, and still believing it wasn't finished. That night, I couldn't bring myself to stay in the house. I walked the edge of our property past the chicken yard, past the edge of the berry patch where it had all started. I stood at the fence and stared into the trees, half expecting to hear something. I didn't, but I did see something low to the ground about 50 feet in. A flicker of light like a candle carried in a cupped hand. It vanished after a second. But I stood there a long while anyway. Elias came out looking for me an hour later. He said my hands were cold as ice. The morning of September 21st began gray and windless. The fields felt still in a way that didn't match the sky. Search teams gathered before sunrise. Dogs were rotated in. Helicopters flew low, scanning heat signatures. Agents were stationed at every road in and out of the county. Still, there was no signal, no note, no demand. Just the ticking clock of a date we didn't fully understand. Around 10:00 a.m., a hiker flagged down a ranger near the western ridge. He said he'd passed a trailhead where the leaves were burned in a perfect ring about 10 feet wide, like they'd been seared from underneath. Morrison and 2 agents arrived within 20 minutes. The ring was still warm. They brought in scanning equipment, swept the area. A second ring was found another half-mile west. Then a third a quarter-mile beyond that. No footprints, no tire tracks. Just heat rings in the moss and soil and a sharp smell that stung the back of your throat like scorched copper. Reed went pale when he saw the pattern. They're using proximity symbols, he said, layering the site, reinforcing a boundary. When Morrison asked what it meant, Reed said, "It means they're not just trying to finish something. They're trying to keep something in. We didn't find the children that day, not in those woods, not in any of the barns we researched, not in the bunkers or the attics or the limestone caves we sent teams into with ropes and spotlights. Every hour that passed felt heavier than the last." By sunset, Morrison made the call to suspend the field search until morning. There had been too many false alarms, too many drained faces, too many quiet stares into brush that gave back nothing. But he didn't go home. I saw him just after midnight standing at the edge of the woods alone, calling each of the children's names one by one into the dark. No one answered. When we woke the next morning, the search was different. It felt hollow, like something had passed through us. The equinox had come and gone, and still no sign, no trace. Just that journal, just that tunnel, just the circle of cages empty and waiting. Most of the investigators believed it was over, that whatever the cult had done, they had done it completely. Even the parents who'd held out hope began to let go in small ways, pulling curtains shut, stopping the clocks in their children's rooms, folding clothing into cedar-lined drawers. No one opened again. The search continued, but with less urgency, less belief. It became about presence, not rescue, not truth, just being seen to try. But Morrison didn't stop, neither did Reed or Wells. They met quietly, reviewing every line of the journal again, looking for anything they might have missed. A date, a name, a place coded in symbols. Something. And then on the 24th, 3 days after the equinox, they found it. In the margin of one of the final pages, barely legible, almost hidden beneath a bleed of ink, was a line that hadn't been transcribed before. A single sentence. The rest awaits below the 7th stone, where no shadow stays. That was all it said. Wells brought in geologists. Reed checked every formation, every outcrop in the surrounding county. They cross-referenced maps, land surveys, historic burial grounds, and rock formations noted in early settler records. Only one matched. A glacial, erratic west of the original tunnel site, huge solitary shaped like a sharpened tooth, rising 20 feet out of the ground. Locals called it the knife stone. It cast no consistent shadow, no matter the sun's angle. And it sat in the exact center of the second burn ring found on equinox morning. That's where they began digging. Quietly. With no press, no crowd, no announcement. Just a tent, some fencing, and a crew who understood what it meant to work slowly. I wasn't there the day they opened the chamber. But I saw Morrison's face that evening. And I knew what he'd seen. They'd found what the cult left behind. The rest of the story. The part that wasn't meant to be found. And somewhere beneath that stone, in the place where no shadow held, something else had been waiting too. Something that changed everything we thought we knew about what happened to our children. And who they had become. The team began excavation beneath the knife stone just after sunrise. They didn't bring in heavy equipment, not at first. Just shovels, headlamps, and a field recorder to document each layer. The soil beneath was darker than expected, looser, richer, like it had been disturbed and replaced more than once. Morrison stayed above with the radio, pacing the tree line in slow circles, only breaking stride when the calls came in from below. By mid-morning, they'd uncovered a trap door, reinforced with iron bands and sealed from the inside. It took nearly 2 hours to pry it open. No hinges, just a weighted slab set to drop back into place if not lifted correctly. Beneath it, a narrow shaft dropped into darkness lined with stone, damp and cold. They lowered a camera first, and when the screen flickered to life, we all stopped breathing. The tunnel was intact, and there were marks on the walls, fresh ones, scraped lines, fingernail lengths, long and desperate. When they went in, they found 7 sets of bedding. Straw mats, each one arranged neatly spaced a few feet apart. At the end of the row stood a low altar made from stacked slate. On it sat a metal bowl scorched black on the inside and a worn leather book with its cover half melted. But it wasn't the book that stopped the agents. It was the photograph tucked beneath it, faded, folded twice. A black and white image of 7 children standing side by side, dressed in plain clothes. None of them older than 12. The picture had no date, no label, but there was no mistaking them. Even after 10 years, I knew. It was Mary and Jacob and Sarah Lynn and the Baylor twins and Samuel and David, standing together, still, their expressions blank, their eyes wide and flat like they weren't looking at the camera, but through it. They brought the photo out in a sealed envelope, but the moment I saw it, I said her name. Not out loud, just in my chest where it folded and sank. Morrison looked at me and gave a single nod like he already knew I'd recognize her. Dr. Kim examined the room next. Her gloves brushed along the stones and paused near a rusted drain in the floor. She didn't say anything, just stepped back and called for a forensic swab. There were no bodies, no blood, but the drain told its own story. So did the symbols etched around the lip of the altar, tiny repeating circles with breaks on the left side, always left, always open. Mitchell later explained it meant passage, movement from one place to another. It wasn't about summoning something in, it was about sending something out. In the far wall, they found a secondary tunnel, narrow and sloped, leading down farther into the earth. It wasn't mapped, wasn't mentioned in the journal. Wells and Morrison made the decision to follow it, taking only 2 agents and leaving the rest behind. The passage was barely wide enough for a single person. They crawled for 30 feet before it opened into a low circular chamber. No light, no ventilation. But in the center was something they hadn't expected, a scorched patch of stone fused and cracked like it had been exposed to intense heat. No torches, no fire pits, nothing that could explain the damage. The scanner picked up no fuel residue, no accelerants. But the temperature in the chamber was still several degrees higher than the surrounding tunnel even 10 years later. The air had weight to it, as if it had held breath for too long. They called in specialists to test the stone. The early results came back with confusion. The heat required to cause that level of fusion would have exceeded any known fire source in the region, higher than standard combustion, higher than any furnace. One lab technician told Morrison quietly, "It's not natural, and it's not mechanical either." He didn't elaborate, just handed the file back and asked not to be contacted again. Reed reviewed the footage again and again. His notes started to fray at the edges. His handwriting slipped into shorthand I couldn't follow, but one line stood out. He'd underlined it twice in red ink. The gate wasn't metaphor. In the following days, more arrests were made. Names from the journal were matched to aliases tracked through property sales and driver's licenses. One man was picked up in Kentucky living under a false identity, another in Oregon in a mountain community with no phone lines. They didn't resist. They didn't speak. They simply waited as the charges were read as if they'd already expected to be found. The last arrest was made in upstate New York, an older man with gray hair and a limp. He was the one who'd signed the final entry of the journal. When Wells asked him where the children were, he smiled. "Not where you think," he said. They crossed. That was the whole point. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He refused food. He died in holding before the end of the week. The autopsy found no signs of illness or trauma, just heart failure. Sudden. Unexplained. With each arrest, the story began to form shape. The cult had been operating for decades, spanning counties and states, moving like a root system beneath the surface. They didn't preach in public, didn't recruit loudly. They waited, watched, chose. The children were selected over time. For innocence, for pattern, for symbolic value. They weren't taken at random. They were taken for purpose. And that purpose had been fulfilled at least in the minds of the people who orchestrated it. What lingered was the question that no one wanted to say aloud. What if they'd succeeded? The evidence said the children were taken, conditioned, used, but it never confirmed their end. The clothing said death. The cages said captivity. But that photo-crisp, recent unaged said something else. No one could explain how it had gotten there, or how it showed no wear, no decay. Lab tests on the paper dated it to sometime in the early 90s. But that didn't make sense. The image showed children who hadn't grown, who looked exactly as they had when they vanished. Reed had a theory, but he never put it in writing. He just looked at me one evening after the room had cleared out and said, "If you believe memory has weight, then so does belief." And these people believed hard enough to bend the world around them. The site beneath the knife stone was sealed off. The entrance collapsed, filled with concrete, layered with rebar and stone. The land was declared federal property. No trespassing, no press, no public access. Morrison stepped down 6 months later. He moved out west. I got one letter from him after that, 2 lines written on the back of a photo of the forest in spring. It said, "Some places don't want to forget, and some things remember you." That was the last I heard from him. I keep the photo of the children in a drawer, not in a frame, not on a wall, just folded once, placed under cloth where I can open it when I need to. I look at Mary's eyes. I try to find something familiar in them. Sometimes I do. Other times it feels like she's looking at something just behind me, something that hasn't arrived yet, and maybe never will. But I know she's not gone. Not really. And neither are the rest. The people who took them believed in transformation, passage, a crossing through fear and ritual into something else. And maybe they were right, because I still feel it even now when the air goes still and the woods fall quiet again, and the sky turns that shade of equinox gray. That something happened. That it's still happening. That somewhere out there 7 children walked through a door no one else could see. And the worst part is, someone opened it for them. The arrests didn't quiet the town the way you'd think. If anything, they cracked it wider. There were no news vans, no sirens, no televised trials, just a handful of unmarked cars slipping down county roads and long nights where front porch lights stayed off. What happened in those woods had started long before we ever touched it, and even now, with names on warrants and sealed indictments in motion, it didn't feel done. There were people who still hadn't been named people who'd sat in church pews or PTA meetings, who shook hands, coached Little League, ran a locksmith shop out of their garage. Wells called it the second layer and said it would be the hardest to peel back, because those weren't the ones who'd built the chamber. They were the ones who'd looked away, who knew something strange was going on and made peace with it as long as it didn't land on their doorstep. Morrison used to call that the agreement, like the whole town had signed something in silence. And maybe they had. The photo never left evidence custody. I asked once, just once, if I could keep a copy, but Reed shook his head. He didn't even let me finish the question. I understood. The real weight of it wasn't in the paper or the image itself. It was in what it made people believe. One of the analysts on the forensic team broke down after cataloging it. A woman with 20 years of experience said the eyes weren't right, that she'd run facial symmetry tests and every single child had matched their own reflection perfectly. No deviation, no asymmetry. That doesn't happen in real life, she told me, her voice dry, cracked. Even twins have variation. This was like someone tried to copy Innocence by hand and made it too clean. She requested reassignment. Never came back. They tried to prosecute the remaining suspects using conspiracy statutes. Some pled out, some vanished. One was found in a motel in Nebraska with no ID, no phone, just a bag full of handwritten notes in a cipher we never cracked. I flew out to review the scene and met with the coroner. He wasn't sure of the cause. Said it looked like starvation, but the man's stomach was full. Rice and beans neatly packed. No sign of damage. Just a kind of withdrawal. Like something had left him and the body just followed. It was the second time I'd heard that kind of phrasing, and I started writing them down. Not because I believed in any of it, at least not fully, but because they all seemed to be circling something real, even if we didn't have the right words for it yet. Dr. Kim continued digging into the journal entries. One of the last pages had a diagram we'd overlooked. At first glance, it was just a series of lines inside a circle, but under infrared faint lettering appeared dates initials, some crossed out. She matched the pattern to lunar cycles going back nearly 60 years. Every missing child in the region had disappeared within 3 days of one of those marks. Not every child was accounted for in the journal, but every mark had a name, and once that detail surfaced, the list grew, quietly, privately. Parents who had never reported their children missing out of shame, out of fear, started calling. Some whispered, some cried. One woman said only 3 words and hung up. The Hill watched. They reopened several closed cases. One from 1971 involving a boy who'd supposedly drowned in the quarry, but whose body was never recovered. Another from 85, where a family left town overnight after a break-in, but no police report was ever filed. Each time the names connected to people on our list, neighbors, cousins, co-workers, long-retired deputies. The pattern wasn't random, it was generational, passed down like a deed. The ritual wasn't just about children, it was about roles. Who takes? Who prepares? Who forgets? I started having trouble sleeping again. Not nightmares. Not exactly. Just a kind of looping memory that didn't belong to me. I'd see the forest at night, the path down to the stone, the feel of that earth under my hands. I knew it too well. And then one night, in that half-wake space just before dawn, I heard something. A sound I hadn't heard in years. The bell. The same one we'd heard the night Mary disappeared. Faint but sharp. Carried by wind that shouldn't have reached my window. I got up, checked every room, checked the locks. Nothing. But the next morning there was a small symbol scratched into the condensation on my car window. A broken circle, left side open. I didn't tell anyone, not even Reed. I just wiped it away and drove to work with the window down even though it was cold. 2 weeks later, the stone was vandalized. Someone had tried to crack it open with a sledgehammer. They failed, the thing's too solid for that, but they left behind a smear of red paint and a single phrase written in charcoal on the ground. They're not done. That was the part that stuck with me. Not the act, but the message. Like someone wasn't trying to destroy the place, but warn us it was still active, still needed attention. Mitchell said the paint wasn't paint at all. It was some kind of iron oxide compound that hadn't been commercially available since the 1940s. Reed said it didn't matter what it was made of. What mattered was that someone out there still believed, still practiced, and might be waiting for the next crossing. After that, Morrison called me from a number I didn't recognize. He didn't say where he was, just asked if the trees had changed yet. I told him yes, that the leaves had started turning. He went quiet for a few seconds and said, "Watch the ones that don't. They remember the old shape." I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to know. We haven't spoken since. The Bureau closed the official case file a month later, classified the ritual group as dissolved through attrition, marked the site as non-active, and redirected resources to newer threats. But I kept everything. The photo, the journal copies, the map. I don't know what I'm hoping for. Maybe nothing. Maybe just to be ready if something starts again. Because I don't believe it's over. I don't believe it ever really was. Sometimes I get calls from people who were kids back then, who lived on the edge of the woods, who say they remember the stone but not how they got there. Who say they woke up with dirt under their fingernails and the sound of bells in their ears. I listen. I write it down. I don't promise answers. I just listen. Because I think the truth is still out there waiting, not buried, not forgotten, just paused. And when it moves again, I want to be the first to feel it shift. I still carry the photo in my mind, though I never saw it again. Not the print, not even a scan. Just the shape it left. It's strange what lingers. I've read thousands of pages since then, some darker than that journal, some more graphic, but it's the quiet things that stay. A name etched into stone. The way a child's voice echoed in that clearing. The feeling when you realize someone isn't lost, not exactly, they've just been made into something you're not supposed to recognize anymore. That's what kept me up for the first few months after the case closed. Not fear, not anger, just a kind of unfinished remembering, like there was still something I'd missed. Something small and true buried between all the data points. I don't think we'll ever know how far it reached. I've made peace with that. There are names we'll never recover, families who will never come forward, whole decades that might be gone one child at a time, folded into the dirt and forgotten. But not by everyone. Not by people like Morrison, who disappeared before the indictments ever hit, but left behind a map so exact it filled in pieces we didn't even know were missing. Not by people like Dr. Kim, who still emails me updates now and then, usually at odd hours, always short, a symbol found in a library book, a phrase buried in archived radio, broadcasts a new lead that leads to nothing. She never says goodbye at the end, just signs her name and moves on. I've stopped trying to write reports. There's no template for this, no line on a form for what it does to a town when it realizes the past isn't past, that it's alive buried just under the roots. Sometimes I walk out past the tree line alone, not far, just to the edge. I never bring a flashlight. I just listen. One night, I thought I heard humming. Faint, high-pitched, like a child trying to remember a song. I didn't go looking for the source. I just stood still until it stopped. Then I went home. Some things aren't for chasing. Reed retired last spring, quietly. No ceremony. Just an email, a keycard dropped off, and a short note thanking me for holding the line. I think that's all we ever did, hold it for a little while, long enough to let the truth through. Long enough to give some of the names a place to rest. There are still questions. I think there always will be. But I've learned that some truths aren't about knowing every detail. They're about bearing witness. About refusing to forget. We can't go back and save everyone. But we can remember them. We can say their names. We can tell their stories even if the endings don't come clean. So if this story stayed with you, hold on to it. Pass it along. Say something in the comments if you want, maybe where you're listening from or who you remembered tonight. Because someone always remembers, even when it feels like no one should.